Please welcome your panelists for Speed Bumps Ahead, China's Belt and Road Initiative, moderated by author and co-founder of Full Sky Partners, Cheryl Wu Dunn.
Welcome, and thank you for coming here. I'd like to first just start out with the introduction to the panelists, and then I'll give you a little bit of a context on the Belt and Road Initiative. So to your far left is Lincoln Leong, who is the CEO of MTR Corporation in Hong Kong. And next to him is Kevin Liu, who is the partner and chairman of Asia Partners Group, and also very well connected to INSEAD, right? And then to your right, my left, is Winston Ma, who is the managing director of CIC, which has a lot of money to invest overseas. And then
just moving to CSIC.
Okay. And then Dominic Ng, who also controls a lot of money as the chairman and CEO of East West Bank. And then we have Perry Wong, who is a managing director of research at the Milken Institute. We really have a brain trust here to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is going to be a very lively and interesting session. First, let me preface, because I just don't know how many of you know much about the BRI. It's kind of a funny nomenclature. In Chinese, it has its name that hasn't changed, but it has gone through many iterations in English. But the most confusing part is, though, it is named after the Silk Route, but the Silk Road part is, the belt part, and the road part is the water part. So it's just, I don't know where they came up with the English translation for that. So just so that you know, let's put up the map of how far this Silk Road, the Belt Road Initiative, stretches. It is global, extremely wide. So the Belt and Road Initiative is probably the largest infrastructure and investment project in history, bigger than the Marshall Project, bigger than the Great Wall of China. So there may be some, visionary legacy goals in mind of the leaders there. It's bigger than the U.S. Apollo program. It covers more than 68 countries, including 65% of the world's population and 40% of the global GDP as of 2017. Perry says that number has already increased in 2018, in just 1 year. China is investing close to $1 trillion, including a railway in Bangladesh, a rail route to Laos, a refinery in Saudi Arabia, a new port city in Sri Lanka, and major projects to create a route to the sea through Pakistan, amounting to 20% of GDP there. It has projects that will include, upgrade rails that already go from China to places like Finland, to Poland, to London from China. This is a giant project. China presents this as philanthropy, and indeed it will really help some countries with infrastructure. But it's also in China's interest, partly to protect its trade and oil import routes in the event of a war with the US. And much of the money comes not in the form of grants, but of loans. And there are some concerns that countries will be unable to pay them back and may have to hand over assets to China. So with that in mind, I lived in China in the 80s and 90s, and I remember people mocking the government for them trying to build Shenzhen and Pudong, and said, oh, this is a big white elephant project. Well, those white elephant projects did fine. Now, China is taking that model to a large part of Asia and the rest of the world, but it will have less control and will face political and economic risks. So what is the scorecard so far on the Belt Road Initiative? What are the risks? What are the payoffs? And do they go only to China? So Lincoln, can you start off with that?
No, thank you very much. Perhaps by way of introduction, just a quick word on MTR, the company I work for. We're a Hong Kong-based company. We are a rail operator. But what we pride ourselves on is the combination of rail and the adjacencies, the value capture, which is for us the property development above our rail stations and our rail depots. For us, as a listed company, as a commercial enterprise, our key focus in the Belt Road Initiative is really looking at the software side of things. What do I mean by that? What we're finding is a number of countries along the Belt and Road have already embarked on, have been building, or have already built their metro or rail systems. What they're looking for would be software. They'll be looking for training. They'll be looking for exchange of ideas, ways that we can collectively all get better together. So what we established about 18 months ago is this entity called the MTR Academy. The whole purpose of the MTR Academy is to share knowledge with other rail operators, particularly operators along the Belt and Road countries. We're using that as an initiative to really learn more about the way of doing business, about the infrastructure development, about the opportunities in many of the countries all along the Belt and Road. As you mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative, very, very exciting. It was 65 countries, now it's 68 countries, spanning a significant part of the world, 60-odd% of the world's population, 40% of GDP. So the opportunities are humongous. We all know that within those opportunities, the demand for infrastructure is also humongous. Even within the ASEAN countries, what we hear is over the next 10, 15 years, there would be a demand for something like 2.5 to 3 trillion US dollars worth of infrastructure.
So compared to the way you've watched how Pudong and Shenzhen have developed, obviously these are much smaller projects, how would you rate how China's doing so far on the BRI?
Well, I see BRI as not just a China-only initiative. I see it as something that China has been spearheading, but I also see a lot of participation. I also see a lot of local participation. I also see a lot of companies and from different countries bidding for and participating in infrastructure projects in these Belt Road countries.
Right, okay. Dominic, from your point of view, what do you think, how is China doing?
Well, I think it's too early to tell because, I mean, this initiative started 5 years ago when Xi Jinping went to Kazakhstan, and then also, in fact, when he was in Southeast Asia, he talked about this great initiative, and it takes a few years to put it all together. And they started working on actually quite a few projects. In that regard, I would say that they're making progress. But you know, these are infrastructure projects. It takes years and years to build, and there's not going to be any revenue for several years until when things are done, and then also the local economy have to appropriately integrate with these infrastructures work in order to create results. So it's going to be years before someone can actually put in verdict. I think right now it's too early to tell, but I would say that this is a much more challenging initiative because of not only because of the size, because if it's within China, if you look at Shenzhen, if you look at Pudong, it's all under the control of Chinese government. It's much easier when you move certain residents out of certain location and then put in high rises and then just calling up Citibank and say, you should move over here, right? It's much easier to do that. But when it comes to working with these other countries, developing countries, now you have local governments there that may or may not be able to perform, and the local economies have to appropriately integrate with these infrastructure that's being built, and all of that have to work together in order for it to be successful. I think that that's why, to a certain extent, you need to have not only the Chinese government who have the will and the financial resources to make a long-term investment in this Silk Road projects, or One Belt, One Road, whatever we call it, but you also need some local communities to a certain extent to perform. And you will find that some of them is going to fail. And then maybe many of them will succeed. But all in all, I think that the Chinese government's plan is to hopefully got enough success to offset some of the failure, but come out to be overall a winner. Because the whole idea is that by 2049, which at that time will be the 100-year anniversary of the celebration of the Communist country
Founding of
party, and I think that will be the time that hopefully I think China is looking forward to an announcement of success. So they're really looking at 2049 to make a decision, and that's the way I looked at it. Is that too early to tell right now?
Right. Well, they're going all in, and the internal campaigning and the internal propaganda has been amazing. So we're going to turn to one video that just gives you an example of the types of things they're doing to sell it at home. Can we see the first video, please?
小伙找到新的工作，终于牵手心中另一半。一带一路的表演容，表演容，一带一路的表演容，表演容。
So they're really trying to sell it, and they're using lots of techniques. Officials now say that, if they say, we're doing something for the Belt Road Initiative or the One Belt, One Road, they say that approvals are easier to get. So everything is now being linked into the Belt Road Initiative. But there was a headline recently in the Washington Post, just like in the last month, and the headline read, "Could the Belt Road Initiative be China's $1 trillion mistake?" So it compares this initiative to the U.S. More than a century and a half ago, the United States was a rising power, racing westward, building transcontinental railways that delivered limited benefits and exacted a high cost from society. The emphasis on quantity over quality ruled. Bridges failed, engine boilers exploded, trains derailed, mismanaged timetables and single-tracked routes even led to train collisions. There was corruption, monopoly behavior, political favoritism towards elites over the national well-being, opaque implementation, a contrast to Britain, which took a slower and more transparent approach. So what do you think? Does China's new Silk Road echo the rampant empire-building project of the U.S. railroads a century ago? So, Kevin?
I think, thank you for the very soft question. I think in order to answer that very soft question, it's important to, in my mind, to understand what Belt Road Initiative is and what it's not, the nature of this, right? I shared my personal view with a couple of real conversations I had with people. I recall 3 years ago, I was in Dalian, and I had a chat with, I will not name the person, a prime minister of a small country that's not very far from China. And he was very concerned at that point. He said, look, I was looking at this map, which you showed earlier, right, the belt and the road. I just sadly discovered my country is not exactly on the map. I'm very worried. So we had a conversation, but the outcome of the conversation is, I told him, I was trying to assure my good friend not to worry, is that I don't think the Belt Road Initiative is about which country, whether it's 65 or 68. I'm sure next year when we talk about it, you have a different number. It's not about exactly which country is on the belt or not. It is about a concept of connectivity, right? I think what China is saying is not that, here's the belt, I'm going to do things in these countries, and if you're not on the road or the belt, you're irrelevant. What China is saying is connectivity benefits everybody, number one. Number two, if our ancestors hundreds of years ago could figure that out through the Silk Road, then it's a no-brainer for people today to figure it out at that point out, right? So if you think from that angle to answer your question, then this is not really a strategy, which is why you never see the word strategy used in the Chinese sort of wording. They pick the word initiative. It's more an umbrella. In my view, I think even initiative is too strong. I think it's just a mindset. It's a mindset to encourage people to think about connectivity. Therefore, to answer your question, I think it's very hard to use the old metrics to measure them, because this is not a strategy, right? You can measure the success of a strategy. How do you measure a success of a mindset? Right? China just introduced a mindset, and for the other countries to think about it. Right? That's why you mentioned the word local participation. Dominic mentioned about the other countries that are involved. This is just an invitation for people to think in a certain way. So I wouldn't even try to ask that question, that how do you measure them today? And I mean, you can ask what's the relevance in the end, right? 10 years from now, we can ask, was that mindset even relevant to this country, to all those countries?
But they are posing it to the world. I mean, it really is a high-risk, potentially, strategy, even though you don't use the word strategy, but they're putting it out there in the world. I mean, Xi Jinping, this is something that he has put his entire, power behind.
Yeah, I think it's powerful. That I agree. I think it's a powerful mindset for people to experiment, right? And that's the other difference between the U.S. as well as we talk about Pudong and Shenzhen. All these other projects before were domestic projects, right? Belt Road clearly has a domestic angle in terms of for China to export its overcapacity, to extend basically its economic sort of a sphere. But it's such a global project. It's a very powerful project. But I just don't think this is as what other people think. This is a detailed, it's very, very different from how China manages the domestic affairs. When you look at the 2025 project sort of plan, right? China not only has a Make China Great slogan, they have 185 KPIs under it. This is not one of them. I haven't seen a single document that says this is the KPIs for this whole thing.
Interesting. Winston, what do you think?
Well, Kevin answered the question from a mindset perspective. Now I have to react to the question from an institutional investor perspective, I guess. I guess, definitely there are challenges, right? To start off, many countries along the road and belt are emerging markets. So the typical emerging markets risks are there, right? Currency risk, local regulatory risk, construction risk related to infrastructure, so on and so forth. So that's there. And secondly, many projects are public-private projects, right? So in many cases, the public initiatives and the private initiatives may be mixed. So for example, I focus more on the digital aspect of the digital Silk Road. So if you think about some of the telecom projects to try to bring access to internet to the people there, and then clearly the public initiative will focus on the digital divide to try to bring access to people, but the private side will be more focusing on the return of the investments, right? And thirdly, lots of risks relating to the cultural difference, right? Different religion, different language, different history. I haven't seen that video before, but clearly it's a very thought out idea, right? To try to bridge the cultural gap, to make sure not only the investment but also the operation for the long term. And finally, on top of all these risks, there's a global sentiment shift relating to this globalization sort of backward a little bit, right? So, give an example, right? The regulatory scrutiny for sovereign investments are clearly on the rise. So much actually. I will become an adjunct professor at NYU Law School this fall on a new course called Sovereign Financing Investments. Now the key word here is law school, right? Not a business school, because it's about a regulatory thing. And relating to this DC story, I have to just, by the way, I comment that the regulatory environment 10 years ago during the financial crisis, when I started at CIC at the inception, was quite different in the middle of financial crisis. Right, and now when the markets are more normalized, actually there's a lot more change to the regulatory mindset. There's so much that every day the course materials for this new course is increasing at a remarkable pace. So overall, definitely, we will see challenges along the way.
Right. Well, I mean, China normally is extremely cautious, but this is bolder than we've seen before. And it carries a lot more risks, right?
Well, our friend just talked about too early to tell, right? So we tend to think about this in the long-term perspective.
You're hunting hurricane.
Yeah. But if you think about it, a lot of the infrastructure investments. Well, let me put it this way: from an institutional investor perspective, infrastructure as an asset class become more mainstream just in recent years, right? It's all related to this low yield, low growth environment. So at this moment, a lot of the infrastructure investments as an asset class is more equivalent to fixed income alternative. So naturally, more investors can get into long-term projects because they look at this probably more from a fixed income perspective.
So Xi Jinping is aiming to use China's wealth and industrial know-how to create a new kind of globalization that will dispense with the rules of the aging Western-dominated institutions that we are so familiar with here. There's no defining blueprint. As you've said, there's no KPIs, no nothing. And it's not a specific, discrete, concrete strategy. But the goal is to really refashion the global economic order, drawing countries more tightly and companies more tightly into China's orbit. So the BRI is a manifestation of China's reglobalization ambitions, especially in the commercial and economic engagement area with neighboring countries. So Mao once said that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Xi is actually testing that to say that power grows out of a rail tunnel. So Perry, what do you think about this new kind of global economic order? And if China is successful, will it become a rival to the US or even a unipolar power? Is this how US loses world dominance?
Well, I like guns. I like guns, but I don't want to draw the guns. I think that would be a very bad experience. I think going back to the wealth of the Chinese, China, so might that be CIC or the banks, but I think if you look back in the past 50 years, 40 years or so, the wealth that the Chinese accumulated is not measured in money. So it's a very, very interesting experience to share if you ask the Chinese government. What they can tell you is, I'm going to show you how I did it. That's the wealth, I think, from my perspective, since I had done a lot of economic developments. So can you imagine a country almost gone bankrupt in 1977, 1978, and then 40 years later, you lived 560 million people out of poverty. Just think about the message the Chinese can show to people in Africa, in Central Asia, in South Asia, by saying not much in words, but just say, I done it. You can too. Just think about that. So this is the wealth I think she is sharing. Second, I think on the dominance side, I don't believe the Chinese leadership actually think. Now, I've talked to officials in China. I don't believe any one of them actually think they can dominate in their lifetime. I don't believe that's the end game. So now, what's the end game then, you ask? This big, so to speak, I can make fun of it, called Brooklyn Bridge over the sky. So what is it then, what the Chinese government is getting? If you look carefully on the Chinese map, 40 years later, after the Chinese put in a lot of money, they built up indeed Shenzhen, Shanghai, Tianjin, Beijing, all the city you can name. The last piece that the Chinese empire, if you want to think about in that term, is the western part of China. It doesn't matter how hard the Chinese government try, and even before PRC, so you're talking about the national government regime back before 49, was never able to turn that piece of land into a secure, prosperous region. But if you look at the map from the ancient times, the Chinese civilization actually was born there. Now, then you think about when a nation go for sea power, as the Brits and us, built our countries, the Chinese thinking about how I can make my border secure, region prosper, and without all the people moving from the western side of the country to the eastern seaboard. Because if you look at all the city, no exceptions, from Tianjin, Beijing, Shanghai, all the way down to Guangzhou, you have overpopulated the regions. So you have water issue, the air issue, but on the western side, if you look at the city of Chengdu, Xi'an, which by the way was capital city in the Han and Tang Dynasty. So if you look around that, then the reason for the Chinese government, if I sit on the table to do the drawing, I would do the same thing. If I can actually link up that part of China to Central Asia, to Europe, instead of going down a long route down south, then loop up, so I can build train all the way using the production base of Chengdu, Chongqing, Yinchuan, all those vast area, not many people, a lot of land.
Can we put that the map up again so that people can see?
Right. So if you look at that, the Chinese government does have very motivated reason to build out the road, what they call the belt. They call them belt, by the way, because they look at the region in Central Asia. You don't have too many people, so you're building bridges over it. That's why they call them belt, okay? So literal translation. Now, if German want to sell more car, VW, Mercedes, car parts, they can go through the landline. Actually, there are studies done by a logistic company. They do the computation on unit cost. It's actually a lot cheaper and faster by doing that shipment. So that's one. And then if you look at the second reason why the Chinese are so eager to go down south and Southeast Asia, the Chinese, I think we look at it today, people always say we have 1.4 billion people. Now, China is one of the fastest aging nations if you look 10 years down the line. So you are not going to have a lot of young people working in China. You probably have more older people with a lot of experience, but not too much labor if you want to do it that way. So you got to migrate to when your economy is getting upgraded to higher value chain, you don't make things. You think of how to make things, just like us in US. So what's the youngest population in Asia? South Asia. So you got to link up to the south part of Asia, so the Chinese enterprise, or you could say, our jobs going to Mexico, right? So that's how you do it. Now, that's the landscape from an economist's perspective, right? So going back to the wealth of the share is the Chinese, when they started building, if you like, the last 40 years, it's infrastructure, then come with urbanization. If we look at South Asia, if we look at Southeast Asia, what's the next game plan for Southeast Asian nations or economies? Urbanization.
China wants to be the leader in that.
Well, whether they are the leader or not, we don't know. But if you look at the Chinese are building those nodes, the transportation nodes, they are not repeating. So in other words, the best node was picked by the Brits, okay? Then secondary picked by us. So the Chinese are building gaps where we don't have very good transportation nodes. So for example, who has the right mind to build a oil energy transport corridor through the most difficult regions? The French didn't wanted to, but didn't build it. The Brit actually ran away from it. And even us, in the 50s and 60s, we look at it and say, well, it's too complicated because the geopolitical reason. So the Chinese negotiate with Myanmar and Thailand, and good luck, right? The two countries at the corner, they lock in historically. So they have to both build for those. So think about the complexity of that.
Right.
So
no, it's very complex, and they actually do have to play diplomat. So I want to show you just the last video that just shows their effort at trying to reach out to the rest of the world too. So can we see the next video?
The belt connects to land, the road moves on the sea. The promise that they hold is joint prosperity. We're breaking barriers, we're making history. The war we're dreaming of starts with you and me. The future's coming out. The belt and road is how.
So an effort at diplomacy. Kevin, you want to actually comment more on what Perry was saying?
That's right, yeah. I think Cheryl got us all on the panel with the promise that all the dancing and singing happen on the video. We just have to talk, right? I just add a small point on what Perry mentioned about the transport nodes, right? And, which is, I think, is a very important point that the British and the American efforts in the past actually already did the major nodes. And I think the Belt Road is a way for China to deepen that connectivity. I was in Azerbaijan 2 years ago. I remember I had this very interesting conversation with a friend of mine in Baku. So at dinner at this sort of old caravan, it used to be like camels came and whatever. And I asked him, I said, what do you think of this whole China thing, right? Belt Road. Oh, he said, it's very simple. He said, look at Baku, right? Let's go back to Perry's point. He said, in that region, he said, we see Tehran as a 5-star hotel, in this big road, right? And we, Baku, used to be a 2-star hotel. All we want to do is to use the Belt Road to upgrade us into a 4-star hotel. So the caravan will have more camels, nicer rooms. I think that's exactly the point. I think the point is, I think the reason, I think the concept may or may not have to do with this singing and dancing has been effective internationally is because it gives people a way to deepen that connectivity. It gives them a way to upgrade themselves. If they were a 2-star hotel for a 4-star hotel in terms of transport nodes, right? I think that's the power of the concept.
Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just add a slightly different perspective, right? Because I think, from the digital economy perspective, I don't know if China is already taking over the dominance from the U.S., but clearly the competition is on, right? Because if you think about it, during the last decades, during the 4G era, right, China has done a lot of catch up on the smartphone and the related mobile applications. But for the next phase, 5G technology, clearly the competition is on. Right? Actually, for the first time, at the same starting line. Now, the interesting about the Belt Road relating to the emerging markets is, if you look at the landscape, the Chinese internet giants and the U.S. giants, for historical reasons, they both established themselves in two very isolated home markets, right? So for both sides, they have to look for the next 1 billion users. And most likely they will come from the emerging markets, many of them from the Belt Road routes. So I think, in terms of the next billion users, the competition is on.
Yeah, well, we want to get back to that too. But first I want to talk about one example that I'd like to get you guys' thoughts on. So there are reports that China is dumping loans on countries and leaving them vulnerable. So the OECD imposes limits on how much developed countries can lend to developing countries, but China is not so restricted because it's not part of the OECD. So take the case of Sri Lanka. Struggling to pay its debt to Chinese firms, the nation of Sri Lanka formally handed over the strategic port of Hambantota to China on a 99-year lease recently, in a deal that the government critics have said threatens the country's sovereignty. So what are the implications for the failure of Sri Lanka, and in what way does this hurt the case of China with smaller countries? How does this help? Does this simply help China? So Dominic, would you take that?
Well, I think that in terms of sovereignty issues, it's more like, for media headline news, it's kind of like interesting reading material, but in reality, I think that when you looked at the situation, in particular with that one on Sri Lanka, there's always going to be projects that in any particular country that don't work out. It's not just One Belt, One Road particularly, but if you look at in many incidents in the past, whether it's from the World Bank, U.S. Exim Bank, China Exim Bank, Asian Development Bank, and then a lot of those sort of like government-initiated development banks are out there to helping developing countries to provide financing that most commercial banks or private banks refuse to do, because by and large, most of these projects are deemed not bankable because, as I said earlier, if you talk about infrastructure project that takes sometimes billions to complete, and then it will be years to finalize, and then it also hinge upon the development of that particular economic environment and then local government cooperation, and all of that makes sort of like publicly traded for-profit financial institution to shy away from it, and that's why we have for many years, whether the World Bank and then Asian development banks were formed, and then it's exactly the reason why China put in the initiative, formed the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and brought in 60, 70 countries and so forth, and then trying to be part of that component to help this One Belt, One Road initiative. And I looked at it as that there are always going to be some projects that may not work well, but I looked at it as that swapping equity from debt, you see that pretty common even in U.S. There are companies that getting into sort of like teeter bankruptcy situation. They have to go to the bankers and say that, well, we need to do some exchange. And I don't believe that will particularly in any way that means that it's an invasion of China.
Well, but
to
it
these
is
countries.
Core infrastructure projects that usually countries don't want to actually give up, give up their rights or their ownership of. I mean, you're talking about the main port and.
Well, I think that's what it get back down to. Sometimes a trade-off, to a certain extent. There are oftentimes you find countries that when they're in that very infancy development stage, and the only way they can actually have a chance of prosperity in the future is that they need the infrastructure, because the farmers cannot deliver, their, food without road, and then without the proper infrastructure in place, port or railroads and so forth, there's no way to actually help these countries to become, to have a chance to go into that, middle class level. And then I also wanted to add a point that, as we talked about earlier, that from Perry and Kevin on this purpose from China, not only they are looking at, extending the population in the West and then in the Southeast, but more importantly, I think in order to ensure security, national security, if you look at the western region, western border of China, and it's also the southeast border of China, and we're talking about the concern of from Islamic terrorists or drug trafficking, and those are the kind of borders that the Chinese government are having some hard time to actually control in a consistent manner. The best way to actually help change the dynamic is to actually help those countries to become more prosperous in an economic standpoint. So it's not only helping the Chinese in the Western regions to also be lifted up to middle class level, which is always the predominant goal of the Chinese government for the Chinese population, but not only lifting their own population to middle class, but also helping these developed countries on the borders to become sustainable so that they would also lift up, then to avoid these sort of like more criminal activities that eventually that allow a peaceful, prosperous, regions. And from that standpoint, I think that what you'll find is that you're going to have some projects that don't work out, and then these banks are going to exercise whatever the right they have. And I don't think that by and large it will be a big challenge. Just oftentimes you can work in an agreement that maybe for a certain period of time, once the country find a way to sustain, and then you can sort of like pay back those loans, and that's kind of arrangement. And it seems to be very much available. That is, I mean, that from both countries working together and figure out how it works. And I think that AIIB will actually provide more guidelines and input. And in fact, if there are other countries also participating, that will make it even less of an issue.
You raised the security issue, so I want to pose the question about how, President Xi obviously has just abandoned the very cautious foreign policy that China was very noted for, and now, this very bold initiative is in some ways, whether it's intended or not, is sort of a showing that there's going to be a sort of a greater power and leadership role that China is going to take on the global stage. So, but what also could be driving, and I'd like to get your thoughts on, these diversified trade routes that they're actually trying to build are very important for energy imports, which, they have always had this problem, bringing in all the energy imports through the Malacca Straits. It's always been very dangerous for them. And so now they're trying to set up lots of alternative routes. So how much of the BRI is driven by geopolitical and security issues for China? I don't know, Lincoln, can you start off with it?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, to me, a lot of this Belt Road Initiative enhances, as we've been saying, as many panelists have also said, connectivity. Enhancing connectivity enhances wealth between and within nations and also enhances trade. What I see from this Belt Road Initiative is an opportunity really for many countries along the Belt and Road and elsewhere to benefit from continued globalization, continued movement of people, continued movement of trade. That ultimately benefits not just China, but many, many countries in the world.
Right. No, I think it does. Kevin?
I think on your geopolitical and security question, the way I think of it is that there are clearly a number of different dimensions under the Belt Road Initiative. I believe the main dimension is the economic connectivity, but clearly, right, it's not only about the flows of goods, it's also about flows of people, flows of technology. I think Lincoln mentioned about how they do on the software side. It's also about the flow of ideas and commonalities. So I think the geopolitical dimension is part of it. I don't think it's a driving factor of it. If you look at China in the past, ever since Deng Xiaoping's time, none of the major topics have been driven really by politics. It's all driven by economics. But one of the side effects would be that in the post sort of BRI world, the global geopolitical order will slightly change, right? Which then go back to your earlier question on should the U.S. worry about world dominance, etc. I wouldn't put it in that dramatic way. But if I were United States, which in the past was the center of everything, would I worry about United States would be slightly disintermediated in some shape or fashion? I would. Right? If you look at AIIB, Dominic mentioned infrastructure in Asia. It's a very simple story, right? Infrastructure needs are in Asia, and savings are also in Asia. In the old world, the money have to go to Wall Street to issue a bond, then come back to Asia. I think efforts like this could disintermediate Wall Street a little bit, and I think that would be what, if I were United States, I would worry.
Well, actually,
not the geopolitical necessarily.
On that point, so what should Americans think of BRI? So should we welcome it as the biggest infrastructure play in right now in the world, and welcome it as a way to bring China into the international stage, or should we fear it because it is a way? I mean, they're getting ahead. If you're looking at this as a competition, they're getting ahead, and this is going to marginalize America in a lot of these countries. Should we support it? Should we oppose it? What do you think, Perry? Why don't you take a shot?
Well, I think we definitely should jump in, and because the most effective way to influence the outcome, if we don't see transparency, if we don't see projects that built to the level or satisfaction of the local people, I think we should voice it, right? So the only way that you can do it is by doing it with the Chinese company. So I think one note, I think there are one reason, I think, especially recently, the critic of the Belt and Road is that they don't invite enough foreign company. Foreign could mean the U.S., European company. So it's not by one country per se. So you have the European countries, many of them actually had mentioned or signed letter to complain about the exclusion. Right? So the Chinese have to learn how to work with other nations in that. If you look at the list of projects, from 2015, I believe, to 2017, there are 1,700 projects under the BRI. So you name one that in Sri Lanka that went horribly wrong. There are projects that actually they do work with the local, in Korea, in other part of Asia, in Africa, for example. But definitely, I think for American firms, they should be in. And actually, there are companies. GE, for example, are doing a lot of those, right? And then you can potentially can see Bombardier and all those companies from America would do that too. So definitely, I think American firms should actually join in. That's the only way.
Dominic?
Yeah, in fact, I think, the U.S. government not participating the AIIB was a missed opportunity. But it's never too late. But I mean, under the current situation, I doubt U.S. will jump in anytime soon. I think that this, by the way, has nothing to do with even the current administration. Because even during the Obama administration, that U.S. have made a strategic decision to pivot to Asia, and in fact, the plan a few years ago was to China getting too big, too powerful, and we need to contain. And then I think that from that standpoint, I think that it just sort of gone in the wrong direction, because I looked at it as that if you looked at what you just talked about in the early introduction on this One Belt, One Road initiative with 69% of the world population and what was that, over 40-some-odd% of the GDP.
51%.
51% now. So it just keeps changing every day,
Yeah,
right?
it goes up.
So how could U.S. as the world leader not be part of that and also to shape, the rules of this major initiative? And I looked at it now. The interesting thing was that never once China said that they didn't want U.S. to be part of it. And then they repeatedly said that this has never been intended to be a solo show. And in fact, they look at that as this is like a symphony. And all these countries can participate like a symphony. And U.S. will delighted to get U.S. to be part of that. So I think from that standpoint, now while the government, I think, again, not being part of it, clearly business that are smart are getting involved, as you talk about GE, Honeywell, Dow Chemical, and Caterpillar. Every one of them are jumping in because you don't necessarily have to run those projects or providing construction and so forth, but you can actually sell equipment, goods, and services to Chinese construction companies or to Chinese, some of these Chinese sort of operating companies to provide, services and goods to these Belt and Roads project. And the other thing is, I looked at the current situation right now is that U.S. companies ought to be aggressively looking at various channels. For example, Hong Kong would be a great channel which is consistently out there, promoting this One Belt, One Road initiative. And the Hong Kong Trade Development Council actually visited me several times to talk about how United States companies can get involved. And I think that the companies need to look at, there will be so many projects that will be available. Initially, it would appear that it will be predominantly the Chinese companies. But gradually, once some of the infrastructure is built, there will be a lot more business or commerce opportunities available for U.S. Business, that whether they are in wholesale or consumer and so forth. And I just see that there's a lot of opportunities out there.
Is this something that the U.S. government needs to take the lead on? And is this something that Trump and Xi have to sort of have a powwow about?
That would be very nice, and that's what I think that unfortunately U.S. not only U.S. The government and take take a position of that we don't have anything to do with it. In fact, we're just going to take pot shot at it. But also, I think the disadvantage of U.S. right now. You look at our U.S. Exim Bank. We don't even have a board that can actually make decision. I'm at East West Bank, had made so many loans to projects from Indonesia to Philippines to Middle East, and through the Exim Bank program, because it's a U.S. government guarantee program that allow the U.S. business to be able to export certain service and products to those countries that were not, again, bankable. For the last few years, we stopped doing that because our internal politics between the Republican and Democrats couldn't sort of put it all together, and then now Exim Bank basically paralyzed. So now, and that's what going back to these people questions about, China's do a good propaganda about this is for everybody can invite to participate, but then it turned out it's only Chinese businesses out there doing these infrastructure projects for a very simple reason, because the Chinese government have development banks that are putting the money in together with the companies who are doing these projects. And U.S. do not have financing available. So that's why the U.S. business have to, in a way, either sell equipment projects on the products or whatever consulting services and so forth to these Chinese companies, or we have to find some other means to provide financing.
So I want to also bring up the whole issue of China's role in bringing the cyber aspect into the Belt Road Initiative. So Winston, I want you to, if you can talk a little bit about that, because that's also another front that we haven't really, that isn't much talked about.
Well, no, okay. So there's several ways to look at this thing, right? The first, at the beginning, at the earlier session, I talked about the competition is on, but the flip side is actually for the next generation digital economy, U.S. China are the two leading innovation centers, and they're at the same line for artificial intelligence, robotics, big data, so on and so forth. With that, essentially, you can think of this. Think about a lot of the issues that both sides are dealing with are very similar. So there should be cross-pollination opportunities for both sides to cooperate, right? To solve very common issues of AI, big data, so on and so forth. So that's something we should all hope it will happen, because if not, we're going to miss out to the fourth industrial revolution in a big time. But the flip side is there's a lot of challenge to this, because just as the world fully recognize the value of data, there's also a very big shift in the sentiment, global sentiment, right, towards data privacy, data security, and cybersecurity, right? So which also requires, maybe the power of Trump and Ms. President Xi about global stakeholders' common approach to these collective issues, because by nature, the cyberspace is hyper-connected.
Right. Well, I mean, if China's going into all of these areas around the world, and what's following is the telecom, and the pipes, the internet pipes that they're also going to have dibs on, that gives them kind of a green field, and it's.
Yeah, one good example is November 11th. Every year, November 11th is for once, right? It's called a Singles Day in China. It's the 24-hour online shopping extravaganza, right? With a 25 billion GMV volume last year, more than the Cyber Friday, Black Friday, and the Cyber Monday combined. But the punchline is more than actually. There are more than 200 countries of vendors and consumers participated in this online shopping 24-hour extravaganza, right? So that cyber connectivity is not something we should ignore. We shouldn't ignore. And for U.S. Not to look into this much larger network beyond the Silicon Valley would be just foolish.
Right. Okay. Anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, maybe I would just comment more from a business angle, right? I think we talk about connectivity, we talk about a lot of things, talk about mindset. So from a business perspective, I mostly commented earlier on the mindset. This clearly has relevance, right? So for us, I work for Partners Group, a Swiss private equity firm. We manage about 74 billion of private assets, mostly in private equity, but also infrastructure. So when we make investment today, one of the consistent theme is, any billion-dollar buyout we do today, no matter where it's in Europe, in the US, there's a China angle, right? It's not only about the infrastructure. I'm talking about private equity business. You would think that has nothing to do with Belt Road. I don't think I talked to my IC about Belt Road, but it's about how do you connect to China? Do you source more? Do you source better? Do you sell more to China? So I think even in private equity business, which seems to be far removed from infrastructure, I think this connectivity concept, connected to China, through China, or with China in mind, connect somewhere else, is a big topic. So I do think for business community here, it is something useful to think about. It doesn't mean you want to be part of that video to sing and dance, to talk about it, but it's something good to bear in mind.
Right, absolutely. So I want to take some questions from the audience. Does anyone have, I don't know if there's a mic. Oh, okay, please.
Yeah, this is mainly for our investor group, Winston, Dominic, and Kevin. In order to attract private money into the Belt Road projects, as a Western investor, I need some covenants, legal frameworks, contract law to guarantee that if the deal goes bust, I can recover. Right now, if China is at the spearhead of these infrastructure projects and financing and designing, how do I, as a Western investor, and let's not forget, Western capital markets have trillions of dollars. The infrastructure needs of Asia are in the hundreds of billions and near trillions of dollars, and China's not going to bankroll that stuff. So I think the wise thing to do, of course, is to attract Western capital, especially from pension funds, endowments, and so on, who are looking for investment opportunities. But nevertheless, I think Western investors are going to have a hard time going there unless there's some guarantees of legal protection, contract law, and enforcement. And those are things that seem to be missing in the discussion. And can you guys give some perspective on the likelihood we're going to get enough of those to satisfy the risk aversion of Western investors?
Yeah, maybe I just start because actually, when I was during my involvement with Davos, there was a specific project on this thing, and part of the perspective I will share, and so Kevin can add, is that the receiving end, on the receiving end, the emerging markets need to develop certain framework to make the investments in that region attractive to global investments. Again, right, we talk about infrastructure as an asset class become very mainstream last couple of years. But when you talk to Canadian pensions or Australian pensions, sovereign wealth funds, most of the investments are in three jurisdictions, right? UK, Australia, and the US. And most of them related to existing infrastructures rather than greenfield projects. So clearly there's a big gap there. So actually, given the time, we just make a reference to a blue paper actually that I was part of at the World Econ Forum last couple of years, where it was called a Long-Term Investment Council, and on the council was like 11, 12 of us from large institutions, and come up some suggestions to the emerging markets about how to lower the risk to make deals attractive to institutional investors.
I think for private sector, it's very simple. 2 points. One is that deals have to be commercial, right? No one is asking commercial firms like ourselves or many of you to join this initiative because of love to China or anything else. This is you have to negotiate things on a commercial basis with everything. But the second point, which is unrelated, is that I actually believe that because of the government angle a little bit, right, some of those political risk mitigation, for example, could be done in a more wholesale way, I think, then in that case, I think the private sector investors would actually benefit from the enhanced risk mitigation compared to the fact that you are an individual project which is not under any umbrella.
So can I?
Sure, go ahead.
Just 2 points, very similar points. One is, could a multilateral organization provide some form of wrap or guarantee to mitigate or reduce some of the risks that had been mentioned? Political risk, currency risk. The other point, and getting back to the commerciality of the project overall, I mean, looking at our business model, we always try to look for adjacencies. How do we capture value from adjacencies? And those adjacencies can add to the revenue stream and therefore the financial viability of an overall project.
Actually, in the BRI blueprints, the Chinese government in the document stated that there shall not be more than half of the funding in the future coming from the sovereign money, meaning including our colleague here, CIC, China Development Bank, China Import-Export Bank. So then they propose that would be, as Lincoln just said, a multilateral lending mechanism, including leverage the AIIB, which I would suspect that they probably will flow RMB as a base to do bonds internationally. That's why the Chinese government in their blueprints, surprisingly, link all the way up the southern end of that One Belt, One Road actually stop in Hong Kong. And I suspect Hong Kong will be leveraged as a financing center, as a platform. So I don't think the Chinese, actually one time I joke about it, since the proposal, the Chinese government have 3 times injected capital into the Silk Road Fund, which fund a lot of the project at this point. mainly state-owned enterprises, about 50 of them state-owned enterprise, mainly on power plants, bridges, constructions, and so on and so forth. So you can see that the Chinese government is not interested nor capable, I don't think anyone is capable, any government, to fund all those projects. So one point have to yield it to the private market. So I think that's why I said that we should jump in, otherwise you are not going to write the rule along with it. And on my second point, the hard part of the PRI probably should be done according to the plan again. We're done in about 10, 15 years, so if you count back, that should be 2025, 2030. Now the Chinese government are very good at doing plans and they follow up and then make sure it's done. By then, the commercial activity would be dominating the whole blueprint. So in other words, the Chinese government would propose to build those bridges, ports, and so on and so forth, but then there are commercial activity being put in, so warehousing, so on and so forth. So I can imagine on the southern routes, which probably commercially more viable because you do have a huge population, you do have a huge urbanization process going. I don't think at that stage private funding would be too difficult a question to ask. So I think it kind of sequenced pretty well. Now, going back, I think Dominic's point earlier, the Chinese used their experience or shared the experience to do this in China. So it worked wonderfully. But when you put that project in places like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, politically are not very stable. How do you do that? That actually is a big question mark. I don't think would be that easy.
Okay, so thank you very much. That means we'll have to reconvene in 2049 to see how well China has done, and you can put in your grades. Thank you very much. Let's give a hand to the panelists.
Wow, 2040.